There's a portrait hanging in a forgotten archive in Virginia. The paint has cracked with age, but the eyes still stare forward with the kind of certainty that comes from never being told no. The man in the painting owned over 2,000 acres, held political office, and built a dynasty that should have lasted centuries. But when historians tried to map his family tree, they found something that made them close the files and walk away. Because what grew from his bloodline wasn't a tree at all. It was a web, and at the center of that web was a secret so disturbing that his descendants spent generations trying to bury it beneath layers of silence and convenient lies. His name was Cyrus Whitlock, and in 1847 he did something that would echo through 5 generations like a curse that refused to die. The Whitlock family isn't in your history books. You won't find their estate on any heritage tour. Their graves are scattered across 3 states, many unmarked, some deliberately destroyed. But their story is carved into the DNA of dozens of living people who have no idea they're connected. People who share blood but not names. People who might have passed each other on the street, felt a strange familiarity, and never understood why. This is the story of a dynasty built on control, on silence, on a man who believed his desires were more important than the laws of God or man. And what makes this story truly disturbing isn't just what Cyrus Whitlock did, it's how many people helped him do it, how many looked away, how many participated, and how, even now, more than 170 years later, the truth is still something his descendants would rather keep buried. Because some family secrets aren't just shameful. Some are so twisted that acknowledging them means admitting your entire lineage was built on something unspeakable. And the Whitlock family tree, it's a monument to that exact kind of horror. Cyrus Whitlock was born in 1809 to a wealthy tobacco farming family in central Virginia. By all accounts, he was unremarkable as a child, average student, adequate horseman, but there was something his tutors noted in their private letters. Something they described as an unsettling quality in the way young Cyrus looked at people, not with curiosity, with assessment, like he was calculating what he could take from them. When his father died in 1831, Cyrus inherited everything. The land, the money, and 43 human beings that Virginia law classified as property. He was 22 years old, and he wasted no time establishing exactly what kind of master he would be. Within a year, the whispers started. Enslaved women on the Whitlock plantation began giving birth to children who looked nothing like their husbands. Children with Cyrus's pale eyes, his narrow nose, his distinctive widow's peak, and Cyrus didn't hide it. He didn't feel shame, because in his world, shame required acknowledging that enslaved people were human enough to be wronged, and Cyrus Whitlock didn't believe that for a second. By 1840, Cyrus had married a woman named Dorothea Pemberton, daughter of a prominent Richmond family. She gave him 3 legitimate children, 2 sons and a daughter, all raised in the main house with private tutors and European educations. But outside that house, in the slave quarters, a parallel family was growing. A shadow dynasty of children who shared their father's blood, but would never share his name. What makes the Whitlock family tree so uniquely disturbing is what happened next, because Cyrus didn't stop with one generation. When his enslaved daughters came of age, he didn't see them as daughters. He saw them as property, and property in Cyrus Whitlock's mind existed for his use. So the children he fathered with enslaved women grew up and bore him more children. His own daughters became mothers to his sons and daughters, and the family tree that should have branched outward instead began to fold in on itself like a nightmare folding in on reality. The records are fragmentary. Deliberately so, but genealogists who have studied the Whitlock case have pieced together at least 17 documented births that resulted from Cyrus's assaults on his own enslaved children, 17 that we know of. The actual number is almost certainly higher, because plantation records were kept by the plantation owner, and Cyrus Whitlock had every reason to obscure what he was creating. But here's where the horror deepens. Cyrus wasn't doing this in secret. His wife knew, the overseers knew, neighboring plantation owners knew, and they said nothing, because in 1840s Virginia, what a white man did with his property wasn't subject to moral judgment. It was subject to property law, and property law was written by men like Cyrus Whitlock. There are letters, correspondence between Dorothea Whitlock and her sister in Richmond. In one, dated 1844, Dorothea writes about the unbearable heat and her husband's difficult temperament. She mentions that several of the slave women are with child again. She complains about the expense of feeding so many additional mouths. And then, in a line that makes your blood run cold, she writes, Cyrus insists these arrangements are economically prudent, as the children will eventually provide labor at no additional cost. She knew, she understood, and she described her husband's systematic rape of enslaved women, including his own daughters, as an economic arrangement. The children born from this horror grew up in a psychological prison that's almost impossible to comprehend. They were enslaved by their own father. They worked land they were genetically entitled to inherit but legally forbidden from owning. Some of them had siblings who were also their half-aunts and half-uncles. Others were simultaneously the children and grandchildren of Cyrus Whitlock. The family relationships became so tangled that even the enslaved community on the Whitlock plantation struggled to navigate them. And when Cyrus's legitimate children, the ones raised in the main house, came of age, they inherited this nightmare. His eldest son, Thomas, took over management of the plantation in 1855, and the pattern continued. Because Thomas had grown up watching his father, he'd been taught that enslaved women existed for white men's pleasure and profit. So when Thomas became master, he simply continued what his father had started. The web grew denser, the family tree became more incomprehensible, and the trauma compounded across generations like interest on a debt that could never be repaid. Then came the Civil War. And for a brief moment, it seemed like the Whitlock dynasty might finally collapse under the weight of its own depravity. When Union forces moved through Virginia in 1862, dozens of enslaved people fled the Whitlock plantation. Among them were at least 9 of Cyrus's children and grandchildren. They scattered across the South and North, carrying with them the psychological scars of what had been done to them. Some changed their names. Some invented entirely new family histories, because how do you explain to a new community that your father was also your grandfather, that your mother was your half-sister, that your entire existence was the result of systematic rape spanning decades? You don't, you bury it. You create a new story, and you pray your children never ask too many questions. But here's what makes the Whitlock case so particularly haunting. Cyrus didn't die in the war. He died in his bed in 1869 at the age of 60, surrounded by his legitimate family, and in his will he left everything to his white children, the hundreds of enslaved people he'd fathered who carried his DNA, who'd built his wealth with their labor. They got nothing, not recognition, not reparation, not even acknowledgement. His legitimate daughter, Catherine, inherited the main house. She lived there until 1891, maintaining a refined Southern lifestyle built on the wealth her father had extracted through violence. She hosted garden parties. She attended church every Sunday. And when asked about the war and what had happened to all the slaves who'd once worked the Whitlock land, she'd smile politely and say they'd simply moved on to find opportunities elsewhere. She never mentioned that many of them were her half-siblings, that some of them carried the same Whitlock blood she was so proud of, that her father's legacy wasn't just tobacco and land, but human wreckage scattered across multiple states. Meanwhile, the descendants of Cyrus's enslaved children were trying to build lives from nothing. They had no education, no wealth, no legal claim to their father's estate. Many of them didn't even have accurate birth records. Because when you're born enslaved to your own father, the state doesn't particularly care about documenting the details. Your inventory doesn't need a family tree. The story should end there. A horrific chapter of American history closed by time and distance, but it doesn't end because DNA doesn't forget. And in 2003, a genealogist named Dr. Patricia Helm was hired by a family in North Carolina to trace their ancestry. They'd heard rumors, whispers passed down through generations, stories about a white plantation owner and a complicated past. They wanted the truth. What Dr. Helm found made her physically ill. She spent 2 years cross-referencing census records, plantation documents, birth certificates, and oral histories. And when she finally mapped the Whitlock family tree, she discovered something that shouldn't be possible. She found living descendants who were related to each other in 4, 5, sometimes 6 different ways simultaneously. Cousins who were also second cousins through a different line. People who shared great-grandparents on both their mother's and father's side because both sides traced back to the same source, Cyrus Whitlock. The genetic consequences were measurable, higher rates of certain inherited conditions. Physical features that appeared with disturbing consistency across multiple family lines, and psychological patterns that Dr. Helm described in her private notes as generational trauma made visible in blood. She tried to publish her findings. 3 academic journals rejected the paper, not because the research was flawed, but because, as one editor wrote, the implications are too disturbing, and the families involved deserve privacy. Privacy. As if silence could undo what had been done, as if refusing to name the horror could somehow make it less real, but Dr. Helm kept her research, and in 2019, when consumer DNA testing became widespread, descendants of the Whitlock plantation started finding each other. They'd submit their DNA to Ancestry websites, expecting to find distant cousins. Instead, they found siblings they never knew existed. They found that the family friend they'd known their whole life was actually their half-aunt. They found that their own parents were more closely related than anyone had ever admitted. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you want to know, or would you choose the comfort of ignorance over the burden of truth? One of those descendants is a woman named Michelle Carter. In 2020, she took a DNA test on a whim, hoping to learn more about her African ancestry. What she learned instead shattered her understanding of her own identity. The test showed she was 42% European, specifically British and Irish ancestry traced to Central Virginia. And when she dug deeper, when she started connecting with DNA matches and following the threads backward through time, she found herself staring at a name she'd never heard before, Cyrus Whitlock. Michelle spent 6 months in therapy trying to process what she'd learned. That she was descended from a man who'd raped his own daughters, that her great-great-great-grandmother had been both enslaved and family to the man who owned her, that the reason she had light eyes and skin that burned easily in the sun wasn't just random genetic variation. It was evidence, a biological record of violence that had been committed more than a century before she was born. She tried to contact the white side of the Whitlock family, the descendants of Cyrus's legitimate children, who still lived in Virginia, who still owned portions of the original estate. She sent letters, emails, Facebook messages. She explained who she was. She shared her DNA results. She asked if they'd be willing to acknowledge the connection, to maybe even meet. Not a single one responded, not one, because acknowledging Michelle would mean acknowledging what Cyrus had done. It would mean admitting that their inheritance, their family legacy, their carefully maintained respectability was built on rape and incest and systematic dehumanization. And that was a truth they simply refused to accept. So Michelle started her own project. She connected with other descendants on the black side of the family tree. They created a private Facebook group. They shared stories and documents and photographs. They built the family tree that the White Whitlocks had spent generations trying to erase, and what they discovered was staggering. They found nearly 200 living descendants of Cyrus Whitlock's enslaved children. 200 people scattered across the country, carrying the genetic legacy of one man's cruelty. Some of them knew pieces of the story, others had no idea. But when they came together, when they started comparing notes and connecting dots, the full scope of the horror became undeniable. This wasn't just a family secret. It was a dynasty of trauma, a multi-generational conspiracy of silence, and the fact that it had remained hidden for so long said everything about how America deals with its most shameful truths. We don't deal with them, we bury them. We call it privacy when it's really just cowardice. Today, the original Whitlock plantation still stands. Part of it was converted into a boutique inn in 2015. Wealthy tourists pay $300 a night to sleep in rooms where enslaved people once served a man who raped his own children. The website describes it as a historic Virginia estate with original hardwood floors and antebellum charm. There's no mention of Cyrus Whitlock, no plaque explaining what happened in those rooms, no acknowledgement that the charm they're selling was built on unspeakable violence. Michelle Carter has tried to get a historical marker placed on the property. She's submitted applications, provided documentation, gathered support from historians and genealogists. Every application has been denied. The official reason is always procedural, insufficient documentation. Unclear historical significance, but the real reason is obvious. Nobody wants a marker that tells the truth. Nobody wants tourists to know that the beautiful estate they're photographing for Instagram was the epicenter of a family horror story that spanned 5 generations. The White Whitlock descendants still refuse to speak publicly about any of this. Some have threatened legal action against people who have tried to tell the story. They claim it's defamatory, that it's an attack on their family's reputation. As if reputation matters more than truth, as if protecting a dead man's image is more important than acknowledging the living descendants of his victims. But the story is finally being told. Dr. Helm's research was eventually published in a small academic journal in 2021. Michelle Carter gave an interview to a Virginia newspaper. Other descendants have started sharing their DNA results and family histories online. The conspiracy of silence is cracking, and what's emerging from those cracks is a truth that America has spent centuries trying to avoid. Slavery wasn't just an economic system. It was a machinery of sexual violence that destroyed families, twisted bloodlines, and created genetic legacies that we're still uncovering today. The Whitlock family tree isn't an anomaly. It's just one of the few that's been documented. How many other families have trees that look like this? How many other Cyrus Whitlocks were there, building dynasties on the bodies of enslaved women and girls? How many descendants are walking around right now with no idea that their family tree is really a web, with a spider at the center who felt entitled to everything he could touch? We'll never know the full answer, because most of those stories are buried too deep, protected by too many generations of silence, lost to deliberately destroyed records and mouths that stayed closed even when they should have screamed. But the Whitlock family stands as proof of what we already know but refuse to admit, that American history isn't a clean narrative of progress. It's a horror story written in blood and buried in silence. And the only way to move forward is to stop pretending the graves aren't there, to stop calling it privacy when it's really complicity, to finally speak the names of the monsters and the victims they created, even when those names belong to the same family tree. Especially then,